USS Intrepid was laid down just 6 days before Pearl Harbor. 17 decks high, 27,000 tons of steel, built in half the time it once took to make a carrier. By the time she reached the Pacific, carrier decks had become the front line. Soon, she was taking torpedoes and bombs head-on, the kind that had already sent her sisters beneath the waves. Her crew had done the impossible to keep her afloat, even building a sail to steer her. But now a new kind of threat was coming for her. One that didn't drop from the sky and run. One that aimed to die with her. USS Intrepid's story began on December 1st, 1941, in Shipway 10 at Newport News, Virginia, where her first steel plates were set in place. She was part of the massive two-ocean Navy expansion, a pre-war expansion plan that would allow the Navy to prepare for a world growing more unstable by the day. The new Essex-class carriers, like her, were designed to replace the older Yorktowns, with larger flight decks, faster engines, and stronger armor. They could carry more aircraft, launch them faster, and survive heavier damage. The Navy was betting on air power, not battleships, to decide the next war. Just 6 days later, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. After that, the pace of American industry changed overnight. Across the country, factories and shipyards went into overdrive. At Newport News, the work ran day and night without pause. Carriers like the 27,000-ton USS Intrepid now sat at the top of the Navy's wartime priorities. Usually, a ship of her size would take 3 years to build. Intrepid was ready in less than half that time. 17 decks high and 3 football fields long, she was bigger, faster, and tougher than the ships that came before her. By April 26, 1943, Intrepid was ready for launch, becoming the 5th Essex-class carrier to reach the water. Vice Admiral John H. Hoover's wife christened her as the crowd roared, but the celebration was brief. More ships waited in line. 4 months later, on August 16th, she was commissioned under Captain Thomas L. Sprague. After shakedown and training in the Caribbean, she steamed toward Pearl Harbor, arriving on January 10, 1944, ready to join the fleet that would carry the war to Japan. Intrepid joined Task Force 58, the Navy's new fast carrier strike arm, for her first taste of combat. On the 16th, she steamed along with Essex and Cabot, bound for the Marshall Islands. Their target was the heavily fortified Kwajalein Atoll, the gateway to Japan's Central Pacific defenses. At dawn on January 29th, Intrepid's flight deck roared to life. For the first time, her crew conducted full combat operations in an actual battle, executing every launch and recovery with clockwork precision. Pilots from Air Group 8, most of them new to war, lifted off into a sky already streaked with tracer fire. In less than 30 minutes, the twin islands of Roy and Namur vanished beneath a haze of explosions and rising debris. Hellcats tore through Japanese fighters, trying to take off, while Helldivers and Avengers cratered runways, hangars, and fuel dumps. Over the next 2 days, every one of the 83 enemy aircraft stationed on the atoll was wiped out before the first troops landed on the nearby islets. At the end of the month, the amphibious assault began. As landing craft circled offshore, Intrepid's bombers struck again, hammering Anuabing Island's defenses until 10 minutes before the first wave hit the sand. Her first bomb of the war destroyed a Japanese anti-aircraft gun. By the time the Marines came ashore, organized resistance had collapsed. By nightfall, Anuabing was in American hands. Its captured guns turned outward to cover the next assault on Roy. The following month, she joined a fast carrier task force bound for Truk Island, the main Japanese naval base in the Central Pacific. It would be the fleet's first major test against a heavily fortified stronghold, and Intrepid was right in the center of it. When the fleet reached striking range, Intrepid's aircraft joined the onslaught. Part of the massive air offensive aimed at what the Allies called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Bombs and rockets tore into airfields, fuel depots, and anchorages, leaving the lagoon choked with wreckage. Fighters swept low over the lagoon, flying with the precision they'd drilled for weeks in the Marshalls. Dive bombers came down in steep dives, setting rows of camouflage hangars on fire. Every few minutes, another Japanese ship went under, proof that the lessons of their first battles had already taken hold. By nightfall on February 16th, Intrepid remained on station with the rest of the fleet. Her decks were busy with returning planes, and her crew was fighting exhaustion and the adrenaline of battle. As midnight neared, radar picked up a lone Japanese torpedo bomber circling just beyond the formation. For 20 tense minutes, the blip moved in and out of range. The gunners held their fire, afraid that even a single burst from the guns would reveal the carrier's position. Then, without warning, the plane dropped low over the water, skimming beneath the destroyer's screen. It followed the faint silver trail of Intrepid's wake in the moonlight, then pulled up sharply over the carrier before circling toward her stern. Banking hard, the pilot steadied his aim and released a single torpedo, streaking straight for Intrepid. It slammed into the starboard side, about 15 feet below the waterline, and detonated deep inside the hull. The blast ripped through the ship's lower compartments. 11 men lost their lives, 17 were wounded, and the great carrier began to list as seawater poured in. Damage control teams fought through choking smoke and rising water to contain the fires and seal the ruptured compartments. Power flickered, and the steering failed. The blast had mangled Intrepid's rudder, jamming it hard to port. Intrepid circled helplessly for nearly 12 hours. Pumps fought to keep her afloat, while the crew waited for the sound of enemy engines. Then a chief machinist came up with an idea so desperate it almost sounded like a joke: to use the spare repair canvas as a sail. Working through the darkness, sailors hauled up a 40-foot square of it and rigged it along the port side of the bow. By using wind and water resistance to counter the rudder's fixed angle, the improvised sail created enough drag to balance her turn. Combined with careful adjustments to the engines, the improvised setup began to work. Slowly, the massive carrier straightened her course. Inch by inch, the endless turning stopped. The carrier limped across the Pacific toward Pearl Harbor, where temporary repairs were carried out. Once stabilized, she made the long voyage east to Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in California, where permanent repairs would restore her to fighting condition and send her back into the war. Engineers and yard workers rebuilt Intrepid from the keel up, repairing structural damage, reinforcing her flight deck armor, upgrading her radar and communication suites, and fitting new 40 and 20mm anti-aircraft batteries along her flanks. Though her top speed remained roughly 33 knots, the overhaul modernized her systems, strengthened her defenses, and brought her crew back to full readiness. By the fall of 1944, USS Intrepid was back in the fight. Now part of Task Group 38-2, under Rear Admiral Gerald F. Bogan, she joined Admiral William Bull Halsey's Third Fleet as it prepared for the Philippine campaign, a massive operation to reclaim the islands and sever Japan's remaining supply lines in Southeast Asia. Reduced to just 3 carriers, Intrepid, Cabot, and Independence, the group swept across the region, striking Formosa, Okinawa, and the Palaus. Their raids tore into hangars, depots, and runways, blinding Japan's ability to respond. On October 20th, 1944, as American troops stormed ashore on Leyte, Intrepid launched the first of many airstrikes in support of the invasion. Her bombers and fighters pounded Japanese coastal defenses, troop concentrations, and artillery positions that threatened the beachhead. All day long, planes lifted off and touched down, filling the carrier with noise, smoke, and the smell of burning fuel. Yet even as Intrepid's crew pressed the attack, the enemy was already watching. Japanese scouts had tracked Halsey's carriers since the strikes on Formosa, and radio intercepts confirmed that a major American invasion was imminent. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters had already prepared for this moment. The Shogo, or Victory, plan called for every available warship to converge on the Philippines in a decisive battle to destroy the U.S. invasion fleet. They came up with a plan to draw Halsey's carriers away from the invasion beaches. A group of old, lightly armed carriers was sent north as bait, hoping the Americans would chase after them. When word arrived that Allied troops had begun landing on Leyte, the order went out. The operation, known as Shogo 1, was underway. Meanwhile, powerful surface groups, including the battleships Yamato and Musashi, were moving in from the west, intent on annihilating the invasion force in Leyte Gulf. At dawn on October 24th, scout planes from Intrepid spotted Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force slipping through the Sibuyan Sea. Aboard the carrier, pilots scrambled to their aircraft as bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes launched in quick succession. Lieutenant Richard Duckett, flying a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, was among the first to make contact. Below, an enormous fleet spread across the sea, made up of battleships at the center, encircled by destroyers and cruisers whose decks bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Among them loomed Musashi, the largest battleship ever built. Duckett pushed his Helldiver into a near-vertical dive. The engine screamed. Flak burst around him. His only thought, put a bomb on that ship and live to tell about it. Helldivers, Avengers, and Hellcats tore through the firestorm. Torpedoes streaked across the water. Bombs plunged through decks, and great columns of flame erupted from Musashi's hull. By the time Intrepid's aircraft returned to refuel, waves from Essex, Lexington, and Cabot were already striking. 36 hits in all, bombs and torpedoes, left Musashi fatally wounded. By dusk, she rolled to port and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. Kurita's surviving ships turned back, battered and disoriented. His attack on Leyte was delayed, but the fight wasn't over. Halsey's fleet raced north after Admiral Ozawa's decoy carriers, leaving the invasion force exposed. On October 25th, Intrepid's pilots joined the assault off Cape Engano. Their bombs crippled Zuikaku, the last Pearl Harbor veteran, and sent Zuiho and 2 others to the bottom. 4 Japanese carriers and a destroyer were gone. Japan's naval air arm was shattered beyond recovery. Intrepid returned to Luzon shortly after, launching fresh raids over Manila and bringing her closer to her first encounter with a new and terrible weapon. In the final months of 1944, Japan turned to a weapon unlike any seen before, the Tokbetsu Kogekitai, or Special Attack Units. The world would come to know them by another name, Kamikaze, the Divine Wind. These were men who took their own lives on their own terms. When their aircraft were crippled and burning, some turned their final descent into a weapon, which the Japanese called a body strike. One of the first acts of what would later be called a kamikaze attack happened in December 1941 over Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Fusada Ida Zero was riddled with fire and was losing altitude. Rather than surrender, he aimed his fighter at the American base at Kaneohe and vanished in a burst of flame. Following this example, other pilots acted on the same impulse, keeping their hands on the controls to the very end, rather than drift helplessly to Earth. As the Pacific War dragged on, Japan's air arm began to be downed, faster than it could be rebuilt. At Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons, veteran pilots were wiped out, their replacements were barely trained, and their aircraft were obsolete. By 1944, the once dreaded Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service was exhausted. Then came Saipan, and with it, the fall of Japan's outer defense line. As Japan's situation grew desperate, officers like Captain Motoharu Okamura proposed a radical idea, turning aircraft and pilots into a single weapon, striking enemy ships through deliberate collisions. Rear Admiral Masafumi Arima put the concept into practice, leading his bomber against the carrier Franklin and perishing in the strike. Word of his sacrifice spread through the ranks. At Mabalakot Airfield, Admiral Takejiro Onishi gathered his men. 5 Zero fighters, each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb, would not return. On October 25, 1944, Lieutenant Yukio Seki led the first official kamikaze strike over Leyte Gulf. His Zero pierced the deck of the escort carrier Saint-Lô, detonating its magazines and sending the ship to the bottom in a single blinding explosion. The success of that first strike marked a new and terrifying phase of the war. Dawn broke over the Philippines in pale, smoky light on October 29th. USS Intrepid was already alive with motion, with planes roaring off her deck and bombers banking toward enemy airfields on Luzon. Below, crews reloaded ammunition belts, wiped oil from their hands, and listened to the echo of engines fade into the distance. By mid-afternoon, radar picked up a formation coming in low from the west. They were Japanese aircraft, fast and closing. Their attack pattern looked wrong. The planes dove hard, but none pulled away. Alarms wailed across the ship as men raced to their guns. Gun Tub 10, the only all-black gun crew on the carrier, swung their twin 20mm cannons skyward. Seaman Alonzo Swan gripped the triggers. A single Japanese plane, lagging behind a failed strike on other U.S. ships, broke from the haze and leveled out toward Intrepid. This one wasn't turning away. Tracer fire laced the air. Swan's crew sheared off one of the plane's wings, but it kept coming, spinning and screaming through the smoke. At the last second, it clipped the edge of the flight deck and then slammed directly into their gun tub. The blast ripped through the gun mount, throwing Swan to the deck. His uniform caught fire, and all he could hear was the roar of flames and the ringing of twisted metal. When he came to, seconds later, the gun mount was gone. He saw his friend still strapped to the smoking cannon, engulfed in fire. Ignoring the burns on his own arms, Swan ran back in. He tried to cut the straps, but the heat drove him back. A moment later, the flames crept across the twisted metal and reached the ready ammunition. The rounds began to pop, first one, then dozens, until what was left of the gun mount erupted in a blinding chain of explosions. A shockwave of heat tore across the deck, wiping out what little remained of Gun Tub 10. Fire crews rushed in, hosing down the flames. 10 men from the mount were gone. Their bodies were carried away on stretchers, the deck silent except for the hiss of steam and the crackle of cooling steel. The survivors, including Swan, were later recommended for the Navy Cross. Despite the explosion and the damage, Intrepid stayed in the fight. Her air operations resumed before noon. Between air raids and kamikaze alerts, USS Intrepid never truly slept. At 872 feet from bow to stern, Intrepid was a world unto herself. Her flight deck towered above the sea, hangar bays stretched below, and 12 decks held more than 3,000 men, 90 aircraft, and every system needed to keep the warship alive. Her 4 Westinghouse turbines, fed by 8 Babcock & Wilcox boilers, delivered 150,000 horsepower, enough to drive her across the Pacific. Meanwhile, from the hangar deck, elevators lifted Hellcats and Avengers into the sunlight, ready for launch. Beneath the roar of turbines and the thunder of catapults, another world existed. Narrow corridors led to mess halls thick with the smell of coffee and powdered eggs, where tired men ate shoulder to shoulder before heading back to their stations. Barbers clipped hair in cramped chairs as the deck plates trembled under their feet. A cobbler mended worn boots beside a humming bulkhead, his tools rattling with every roll of the ship. And tucked deep in the carrier's heart, a tiny soda fountain served milkshakes and scoops of ice cream. When the skies cleared, life shifted to a different rhythm. Sailors lowered the forward aircraft elevator to hangar level and rigged baskets to its rails, turning the steel chamber into a makeshift court. Some stood on deck at night, looking out over the dark water, thinking about home. For all its guns and armor, Intrepid was also a shelter. Still, there was little time for reflection during the war. After replenishment and minor repairs, Intrepid returned to the Philippines, continuing air operations to neutralize Japanese airfields and shipping, threatening the Leyte landings. On November 25th, she was launching strikes against Japanese airfields in Luzon when general quarters sounded across the ship. 25 Japanese aircraft were coming in fast from the south, intent on smashing through the American fleet off the Philippines. Engines roared as Intrepid's fighters clawed into the air, throttles wide open. Moments later, the sky above the task force erupted with tracer fire, stitched across the clouds, as American Hellcats tangled with the diving enemy. Smoke trails and falling wrecks scarred the blue horizon as pilots from Air Group 18 fought furiously, cutting down several attackers before they could reach the fleet. The formation kept coming. A second wave of kamikazes broke through the fighter screen, skimming low over the sea, sunlight flashing off their wings as they lined up for the carriers. Anti-aircraft guns opened up in a thunderous wall of fire, the ocean boiling with near misses as the Japanese planes dove straight through the barrage, intent on striking their targets. One enemy plane broke through, diving straight for the carrier. It came in low and fast, crashing headlong into the flight deck. The impact tore open the steel surface, setting off a roaring inferno of aviation fuel, battling the blaze amid exploding ammunition and falling debris. Then, out of the smoke, another kamikaze punched through the defenses, slamming into the hangar deck and detonating deep inside the ship. Flames towered hundreds of feet into the air. The heat was so intense that the deck itself began to buckle. On the bridge, the captain gave the coded order, quote, "The bear went over the mountain," meaning abandon ship. The crew couldn't hear him, since the attack destroyed the sound system. Instead, they fought the fires back with hoses, sand, and bare hands. Nearby, the battleship New Jersey moved alongside, her guns ready to ward off more attackers. The instant the first plane hit, Lieutenant Donald DeMarzo was already moving toward the fire. As Intrepid's fire marshal, it was his duty to face the flames head-on, no matter how hopeless it looked. He found hoses tangled, fire mains ruptured, ordnance cooking off in every direction. The blast heat peeled paint from the bulkheads. Still, DiMarzo climbed through the smoke, shouting for his men, pulling them together. Through choking fumes and searing heat, he led the damage control teams forward, shouting orders over the roar of pumps and the hiss of foam hoses. Step by step, they pushed into the burning wreckage, fighting to stop the flames that had swept across the forward flight deck. When an explosion blew open a hangar door and a sheet of flame rolled through, DiMarzo didn't fall back. He pressed in, directing streams of water and foam until the blaze began to quell down. Then the second kamikaze struck. The explosion ripped through the hangar deck, setting off a new storm of fire and shrapnel. DiMarzo was thrown down, but rose again, rallying whoever could still move. He knew that if the flames reached the bomb magazine below, Intrepid would go up with every man on board. So he stayed. Even as the deck buckled beneath his boots, he kept his men on the hoses until the flames finally gave way. When the last fires subsided and the ship was safe, DiMarzo was gone, lost in the inferno he'd fought to stop. Despite the devastation, Intrepid never lost propulsion, nor left her station within the task force. It only took 2 hours to take out the fires. The decks were blackened and twisted, the air still thick with smoke and salt, but the ship was still moving and fighting. Along with DiMarzo, 72 sailors perished in the double strike. That night, under a gray Pacific sky, the crew gathered for a burial at sea. The next day, Intrepid turned east for home. She steamed across the Pacific to San Francisco, arriving on December 20th for repairs and refit. Tokyo Radio hailed the kamikaze attacks on Intrepid, Essex, Cabot, and Hancock as victories. Official broadcasts claimed that dozens of American carriers had been sunk and that the tide of war was turning. These announcements were wildly exaggerated, but within Japan, they ignited a brief surge of nationalist fervor. Newspapers called the kamikazes, quote, the divine thunderbolts of the empire. Privately, however, Japanese naval leaders knew that the attacks, while damaging, had failed to halt the U.S. advance. Each mission had cost irreplaceable pilots and aircraft for only limited results. Still, the impact on both sides was clear. The Japanese saw the kamikazes as proof of their determination to keep fighting, while the Americans realized the enemy would fight literally to the last man. For Intrepid, those attacks became part of her story. No matter how hard she was hit, she would always come back swinging. Her crew took pride in that toughness and started calling her the Fighting Eye. By the spring of 1945, Intrepid was back in action. Ahead lay Okinawa, the last and bloodiest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Her air group joined the opening strikes on the Ryukyu Islands, pounding airfields and shore defenses to clear the way for the landings. On March 18th, a twin-engine Japanese Betty had broken through the defensive screen and exploded only 50 feet off Intrepid's forward port bow. Flaming gasoline and debris showered the hangar deck, but the fire was snuffed out before it could spread. The very next day, Intrepid's aircraft struck back, joining massive raids against what remained of Japan's fleet, damaging 16 ships, including the battleship Yamato and the carrier Amagi. Less than a month later, on April 16th, another Japanese plane dove straight into Intrepid's flight deck, erupting in a ball of fire that tore through parked aircraft and spilled burning fuel across the planks. 8 men were lost and 21 wounded. However, by now, the crew had been drilled by the lessons carved into them at Leyte. Within minutes, damage control teams moved with clockwork coordination, sealing ruptured fuel lines, smothering fires, and clearing the wreckage. Less than an hour later, the burning gasoline was extinguished, and 3 hours after the crash, aircraft were again landing on the carrier. Halfway across the Pacific on August 6th, her plane struck Wake Island, participating in one last assault against an isolated Japanese outpost. That same day, far to the north, Hiroshima vanished beneath a single bomb, and soon the war was over. A year later, Intrepid was decommissioned. She was placed in reserve, moored beside hundreds of idle warships waiting for a new purpose. For years she sat in the bay, gray and still, until the Cold War demanded her return. On February 9th, 1952, Intrepid was brought back to life. She steamed for Norfolk to be reborn as a jet carrier. Workers swarmed her decks, cutting, welding, and installing the technology of a new era. Steam catapults, reinforced elevators, and later an angled flight deck that allowed jet fighters to launch and land simultaneously were added. She returned to duty as attack carrier CVA-11 in 1954. 2 days after testing her catapults, Intrepid rejoined the Atlantic Fleet. Throughout the decade, she prowled the Mediterranean, drilling for the unthinkable, a war with the Soviet Union. She took part in NATO exercises, mock invasions, and crosswind launch tests that would shape carrier aviation for years to come. In 1962, Intrepid was given a mission unlike any before, one that reached beyond the battlefield and into the stars. She was tasked with recovering astronaut Scott Carpenter, one of America's original Mercury 7 and the second American to orbit the Earth. When Carpenter's Aurora 7 capsule splashed down hundreds of miles off course, Intrepid launched her helicopters into the Caribbean sky. Hours later, they spotted the capsule bobbing in the waves. The crew hauled Carpenter aboard and flew him back to the carrier, where sailors cheered as he stepped onto the deck, grinning and sunburned. 3 years later, she repeated the feat. On March 23, 1965, Intrepid recovered Gemini 3 after the first controlled re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. Her helicopters lifted Major Gus Grissom and Lieutenant Commander John Young from the sea, then retrieved their spacecraft, nicknamed Molly Brown, and returned them all safely to Cape Kennedy. In the years that followed, Intrepid shifted from combat to training and support, carrying new generations of sailors as jet aircraft and missile ships redefined naval warfare. Finally, on March 15, 1974, after 30 years of service, the Fighting Eye was decommissioned for the final time.